a World Economic Forum report says election disruption from AI is the biggest risk this year. Despite the benefits innovation can bring, the paper urges leaders to focus on cooperation and building guardrails against AI. Benji Heyer starts us off.
I'm Shamaine Daniels, and I'm running for Congress.
Shamaine Daniels is running for Congress for the Democrat Party in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania. But she's not doing it alone.
This is an opportunity to really amplify the number of people and the types of people who participate in the campaign process.
My name is Ashley, and I'm
with her, a technological weapon, an artificial intelligence campaign volunteer. Ashley is not your typical robo-caller. Her creators say she's the first political phone banker powered by generative AI technology similar to ChatGPT, and she's capable of having an infinite number of customized one-on-one conversations at the same time. For Shamaine, it's an exciting new tool that could change the game in 2024, with congressional and presidential elections in November. Yet, in an unassuming room in London, a stark warning. Authors of a World Economic Forum report fear this sort of technology used more widely could worsen an already polarised political landscape, poisoned by deepfakes and bots.
Given the sudden accessibility of user-friendly interfaces like ChatGPT or larger-scale AI models or synthetic content to manipulate public opinion, it's no wonder that misinformation and disinformation is ranked as a top risk short-term. The potential impact on elections worldwide over the next 2 years is significant, and that could lead to elected governments' legitimacy being put in question. And this, in turn, could, of course, threaten democratic processes, lead to further social polarization, riots, strikes, or even intrastate violence.
There have been efforts by the Biden administration to reduce risks posed. The White House last year announced that AI developers will adhere to new safeguards. Yet it's hard for governance to keep pace with technological advancements.
We do not have the kind of ethics infrastructure or oversight infrastructure or even the public education to respond to the fact that we can now create a bunch of artificial entities that put information out there. They just pollute or can pollute our information ecosystem. And it's not just that we don't have the tools to fight that. People aren't quite prepared. Like, we see this all the time when people go to use ChatGPT for something and then are surprised when it hallucinates or makes up some thing that's not quite true.
The World Economic Forum says AI, which was all the rage at an expo in Las Vegas this week, will augment other major global risks over the next 2 years, ranking it ahead of war or economic weakness. But in the longer term, extreme weather, climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and national resource shortages. These, according to the report, are this decade's greatest perils for humanity. Benji Heyer, CGTN, Washington.
With worldwide growth challenges, the UN Labor Agency is predicting that unemployment will rise this year. The ILO says that the global unemployment will rise to 5.2% this year. It's a little higher than last year. There was a growth spurt after the pandemic, but that's now flattened out. They say that low and middle income countries should continue to see job gains, while the upper middle income countries are expected to lose jobs this year. The good news is that in 2025, it's expected to be better. For more about this report from the World Economic Forum, we'll check in now in the next 2 to 10 years as to what might we expect. Anthony Chan, former chief economist at JP Chase. Good to see you again. Hope your year's off to a good start. I don't want to throw cold water on what appears to be a recovery in the global markets, but this report seems unusually, negative.
Well, Phil, there's always going to be some caution out there. And the fact is, we've had an economic recovery for the last couple of years. And when that happens, you're going to see some challenges. As remember, the whole world has been battling inflation. And to do that, they've introduced restrictive monetary policy. So it stands to reason that we'll see a little bit more sluggish economic growth, or at least the risk of that, in 2024, and that could certainly mean higher unemployment rates. But again, don't lose sight of the fact that the price of higher unemployment has been that we've, or the benefit has been that we've lowered inflation.
Right, and And by the way, I want to preface this by saying this report is a global report, so it is very difficult to parse particular regions, whether it's China, the U.S., or any country in Europe, and clump them all together and say, well, the whole world is either growing or slowing, because there are just so many factors. Two of the big geopolitical events, obviously we're seeing one in the Middle East. We still have one in Eastern Europe. Are those things that you look at as a strategist and as an economist when you think about the data that goes into, in aggregate, all of these countries?
Oh, absolutely, Phil. And the reason for that is that the world is more connected than it was when you and I were growing up, Phil. We know that now these conflicts not only introduce danger from a geopolitical standpoint, but they also introduce economic dangers, supply chain dangers. You've seen what it's doing in the Middle East with extending supply chains, or certainly putting pressure on them, which will mean upward pressure on prices. And it could be a disruption to economic activity. And of course, the risk that somehow these global conflicts are spread out even further certainly causes concern among economic forecasters.
And there's a disconnect too, right? You mentioned that rates, yes, they've gone up, but we've leveled off. In fact, some countries, including right here at home, they're talking about potentially cutting risks, or cutting rates, I should say. And that's giving investors sort of this awkward bullishness that, yes, bad things have happened in 2023, but they're expecting all this good things. And throughout the word, I've heard the word even quantitative easing again just in the last week. Is that a disconnect?
Well, the voices of quantitative easing are not very loud. The voices are more for the cessation or the ending of quantitative tightening, which could come sometime at the end of the year. I think it's premature to discuss quantitative easing when we still are undergoing quantitative tightening. But the whole world is moving in that direction towards easier policy. Whether you look at Japan at some point late in the year, you can see something. In China, you've seen stimulative policies. In Europe, they're talking about potentially lowering rates as the year progresses. And of course, here, our own Federal Reserve in the United States has talked about cutting rates 3 times, and the financial markets are expecting 5 to 6 cuts in rates. So why is that happening? Not so much because they project bad things to happen in the United States or even in Europe, but because there's been some progress in inflation. And if there is progress and you don't lower rates, then it means policy becomes even more restrictive. They don't want to do that because that could really cause some something to break. And we saw that here in the United States in March when we had a mini banking crisis.
Assuming that you're right, and we continue to see progress on the inflation front, places like the ECB and the U.S. Fed, when we talk about rate cuts, we're not talking about them going to zero. They've raised them so much. What is the right expectation? What should we expect them to do when you talk about cutting rates?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because what I think the Federal Reserve wants to do is not necessarily ease rates to super low rates. They just want to maintain a neutral policy stance relative to what's going on with inflation. So if inflation is easing, just to maintain the same type of monetary stance, they have to lower rates in order to adjust for the lower inflation, because otherwise real interest rates actually end up rising. The last thing I think the central bank wants to do, and you've seen some pushback from some Fed officials, is to lower rates to such low rates as you mentioned, 0 or something close to that, and then cause financial conditions to actually ease and cause inflation to go up. But one of the things hinted in your previous question, Phil, is that if we get these geopolitical risks to increase, then we're going to get those supply chain negative effects again, and that will put upward pressure on inflation, and that will cause central banks all over the world to be more reluctant about easing rates, because it'll be a risk that inflation flares up again as these supply chains, which caused problems during the pandemic, will once again put upward pressure on inflation.
I got about 30 seconds, and I always like to ask these things because you're the expert. Are you surprised that we've raised rates so much, yet we haven't really seen a noticeable impact, at least to the jobs and the unemployment, specifically here in the U.S.?
Well, I think that's happened, Phil, because we've had so much pent-up demand. You've seen that in the labor market. And if you have pent-up demand in the labor market, then guess what? It means that people are still going to have jobs. People are still going to have potential spending power. And that's why the economy hasn't slowed down. The secret is pent-up labor demand, which gives consumers the wherewithal to keep spending. And remember, consumers are 2/3 of the economy. So it should not really be a big surprise when you have such conditions.
Anthony Chan, always good to see you, my friend.
Pleasure.